We are just so very excited, really very blessed to have Pastor Rob Bryceson with us this morning. Hi, Rob.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
Good to be here with you. We've been looking forward to this conversation for some time now, and so excited that you are our next church in action. And when we get out into the community and find out more about churches in our community and what they're doing, we're always very excited about that. So looking forward to that, Rob. And the name of your church is the Gathering House, and then you have the Streetwise Cafe, which we just heard a little bit about. We're going to talk about that and find out more about, the ministry and what you guys are doing. But first of all, we want to get more acquainted with you and get to know you a little bit more. So tell us a little bit about yourself. And
I'm a Cheney guy, born and raised. Went to high school at Cheney, and I go back 5 generations in this area. And 1988, I was going to leave Spokane, vowing never to return. Young person, like, I'm going to go see the big wide world. I had been involved in churches. I had gotten saved in a Assemblies of God church. For a season, I had led worship at Calvary Chapel when it was back on Nora, about the days that Ken Ortiz was first arriving. And so I left Spokane with the Joe Weldon Band, and I went off to Hume Lake Christian Camps in California. And at the end of that, I wasn't sure what was going to happen. We were just kind of wide open for life, and spent 20 years doing ministry, being away from Washington State, most of it living in the San Francisco Bay Area. Worked in a bunch of different churches, led worship, was on boards of missions, planted a church. And when the housing market crashed in '08, I just packed up my family and we decided to come back to Spokane, where my kids would know their aunts, uncles, and cousins and just see what life would bring us.
Yeah. And so that's what brought you back here.
Yeah.
Interesting.
We weren't
bet that was
intending
quite
to stay
a change.
in ministry. Yeah, we were going to be done with ministry. We were like, let's do something else with our lives. And and God had other plans.
So that's interesting in and of itself. There, we were done with ministry. There's a story there.
Yeah.
There's probably a lot of stories there.
A lot longer stories to tell. But just a sense of, I'd been in enough churches and worked enough, and I'd felt the frustration of being in church work. You get caught up in the 501c3 nonprofit business corporation, and you're always trying to run this nonprofit corporation while you're trying to do kingdom work. And I had just kind of been spent. I had seen enough stuff, and was going to say, I just want to try to do something else. And so that was our intent when we came back, but God had other plans.
As he always does.
Yeah. So we got here. I had spent a year, actually, prior to moving to Washington, looking for work. I'd sent resumes from Maine to Australia, looking for a church position, and it didn't happen. So I figured, okay, God's letting me, he's releasing me. So we came back here, and my wife and I got into an argument about getting a job. And and I ended up going to prove her wrong, because I was trying to tell her, all I know how to do is ministry now. And you don't just open up the newspaper and find, oh, here's a pastor job, or here, let's find a church that wants a pastor. We'll find him on Craigslist, right?
Right.
So I said, it doesn't work that way. You got to schmooze people and know folks. And you got to. So to prove to her that you don't get a job in ministry by knocking on doors and handing out resumes, I went to the dirtiest, rattiest, nastiest downtown church that I could think of, which was on the corner of 2nd and Division, and I didn't know the name of it, and I knocked on all 6 doors till some guy finally answered it, and that's how I got the job.
Which, you were determined to prove your wife wrong, and you ended up with a job that day.
Yeah, I guess I showed her, and I ended up. It was just the craziest thing. And I've been from Canada to way down south in Idaho. If anyone's been to Spokane, you can say, oh, that big brick church kitty corner from Dick's Burgers on Division downtown? And they'll say, the one they tore down? And I'll say, no, the other one that's still standing. I pastor that church, right? Okay. But no one ever knows the name of it.
Yeah.
Right? It was First Covenant. Okay. It had sat on that corner since 1905. The church itself is actually 130 years old. Wow. It's 1 year older than the state of Washington. And so the church had been ongoing all this time.
Yeah.
So we find ourselves in this downtown, dying little church, just a handful of people holding on to a building without an understanding of what they should do. And we decided, well, let's put the building up for sale because this church is going to close down and there's nothing going to happen. So we put it up on the market and decide, well, in the meantime, while we're waiting for a sale, what should we do? And we just felt this call to love our neighbor. Well, in that corner, your neighbor's a homeless guy, a prostitute, a drug addict, a mentally ill person.
Yeah.
And so we're like, I don't know how to love these people. I just come from Pleasanton, California, where they don't build a house for less than $700,000. So one night, she makes a big vat of chili on a Monday night with sheets of cornbread in our church kitchen. And I walk the alleyways and the byways with a little tiny flyer that says, hey, come on into the church, watch Monday Night Football with me. We'll give you a free meal, and we'll pass out some hats and coats and gloves. We'll have a fun time. 3 rules. Don't come high or drunk. Be polite. Don't ask for money. And so 35 people showed up that first night.
Wow.
And I had to drop one of the rules. I had to just, after that, it was only 2 rules. Be polite. Don't ask for money. They couldn't keep the first rule. And within a month, 150 street people were coming every Monday night.
Wow.
My goodness.
And then we moved our meal to Sundays because I did everything wrong when we got started. And we moved our meals to Sundays when I started talking with other churches and people around. And we did a thing downtown where each church sort of took a night. Oh, you're the Monday night? Okay, you guys are the Tuesday night? All right. We'll be the Sunday afternoon. So we did the Sunday afternoon meal for 6 years.
Wow.
That's a great story, great ministry of where you're planted. We're talking with Rob Bryceson of the Gathering House in his early days here in Spokane. Now, you mentioned rule number 1. You
don't come high or drunk.
Yeah, so
we had to drop that rule after the first night.
Yeah, I can understand it, but I mean, how did you manage that? How did it work out?
Well, what we said to people was, can you be polite?
Okay.
And polite became the thing.
Yeah.
If you can be polite, then okay. And as the meals grew, the street people started to see it as sanctuary, their turf, their place. So we saw a lot less needles and beer cans around the church. We had no broken windows anymore. They started to take care of the church grounds because we were giving them this meal and entertaining them. Street people can get food. They can get coats and gloves. That stuff happens. You know what they don't get is recreation. Very little recreation. So we were fun.
Yeah.
You know, we were giving out hats and coats and gloves, even trivia questions and that kind of thing. I'd get big gifts like bicycles get donated or large backpacks that were really cool and you could pack your whole life in it. And we'd play like minute to win it games where you stack 36 cups up in a minute and you win the backpack or the bike. And they would cheer and laugh and have fun. I remember after doing one of those games one time, a guy came up to me and he said, hey, Pastor Rob, I watched all these people cheering for that lady to win that prize. And I've never seen that. I said, what do you mean? He goes, everybody wanted her to win. They were cheering for her to win.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, I don't see that. Because down on the street, it's all competitive.
Sure.
How many people get the bed? How many people can get how many people can get the service, right?
Right.
And you've never seen everybody cheering for someone.
Wow. Yeah, they're all about survival.
Survival.
Wow, interesting. So, you know, it's just amazing what God can do when you just, reach out with the love of Christ and, you know, in a very simple way, and just to help meet the needs of other people, and then to think, you know, that they ended up respecting, the church grounds, and that's not something that you had to work to make them do.
No,
that just came naturally.
It was sanctuary was the sense that they all knew that this meal was their place to bring it safe. And I always had this rule. I said, hey, whatever's gone on outside out there, out in the alleys, the streets, you can't bring it inside. So I had guys who'd been in knife fights with each other sitting across, the room, but they knew once you're in here, it's all calm. And it would be like, if you can't keep it calm, you need to go outside, right? And I'd have, typically there'd be a transient guy coming through, hopping off the bus, moving through town. And that guy might come to our meals and get a little edgy and uppity and try to, bully me a little bit. And I would usually get a couple guys, we'd sit them down at a table and I'd say, hey, look, I know you're new in town. You don't know who we are. And I know you don't trust us, but I want you to know something. If you keep acting like this, see all these guys in this room right now, they love this meal. And if I have to cancel next week's meal because of you, I'm going to tell them you did it.
Oh, now that would work pretty good.
Oh, that calmed them right down.
I bet it did.
So
I bet it did.
Yeah, we never really had trouble. And
Yeah.
and I'd kick people out and I'd tell them,
Yeah.
you come back next week when you're not quite so high or not quite so drunk or when you can be polite.
Yeah.
And they would do that. So
Yeah.
it was interesting.
But you obviously had a fair amount of street smarts going into this because or is that something that you just learned on the fly?
On the fly. I knew nothing. I'd never been on this rung of the lowest possible rung of American society.
Right.
These street people.
Okay.
I didn't know anything about them. Didn't know how they worked, didn't know their culture. They play by a whole different set of rules than middle class people. They have almost like a jail sort of sense of how you do things. And so I had to learn everything. And I went to the Spokane Homeless Coalition in order to learn. And at that time, there's like 30, 40 different little agencies and case managers and people who worked on the streets. And they would be in a room and they'd just sort of meet once a month to talk about what to do. And I just started learning everything I could from them. And they would eventually elect me to the chairmanship of that. For a couple of years, I was the chair, which was really interesting because I was the only Christian pastor in the room. No churches would go to that meeting, so I was it, right? And they tended to be more of the liberal side of, theologically, I would say they were like conservative evangelical Christian pastors are not our friends. So when they elected me to the chairmanship, it was really an interesting season.
I bet.
And I learned a lot, and I got to befriend a lot of them. So
yeah. So how long now were you serving at that church in that area?
Down there, 6.5 years doing those meals and working with the street. And we got to know, the city got to know us pretty well. And Sheriff Ozzie. And, we built a pretty good reputation in Spokane as the church that worked well with the street population. And I had a bunch of the street people, because they trusted us, eventually come to church. Just street people have all been preached at. That's very rare to hear someone. They've all had to listen to the sermon to get the sandwich, listen to the sermon to get the coat, listen to the guys sing the song so that they could have the meal. They've all done that. So to them, the sharing of the gospel is a con game. You come down here and tell me about your Jesus. I pretend to accept him, and then I can maybe con you out of $20 if I tell you I need prescription medications and I'm out of my prescription, right? So it's just a con game to them.
I can see that.
What they needed and didn't get was someone sitting them down and saying, "Tell me your story. Tell me about you." And they don't tell each other their stories, right? So I asked one lady once, her name was Montana. I said, "Montana, why don't you tell each other? Why don't you get to know your friends?" She said, "Why? My life's nothing but pain, and their life's nothing but pain. Why should I dump my pain on them, and I can't take their pain on me because I can't take any more?"
Totally makes sense. But they've just never had anybody who really cared enough to know about their story, right? And that's what you're saying.
And then you have to build a lot of trust before they will tell you their story.
Yeah, I bet.
So you can't show up once or twice and think you're going to get into their lives. They're way too wary of that.
Right.
So, Rob, you did this for 6.5 years, downtown Spokane. Who's kind of taken up the mantle of this downtown Spokane right now since you've left?
Well, if you're talking about ministers and pastors, Chris Merkling over at Orchard's doing a good job. Of course, John Repsold at Mosaic is doing, kind of waiting to see if, what New Community might do in their new building. They bought the old Central United Methodist. And so we're seeing, but working with street people is its own dynamic, and it doesn't help your church. Because what we had is 150 people coming to our meals, and then I'd get 30, 40 of them to come to a church service over a month, and we'd really help 10 or 12 get their life back. But, we would have, not everybody was sober in church on a Sunday morning. In our church, it was like if you woke up under the freeway that day and you have your dog in your bedroll, you roll up your bedroll and you walk over to church, what are you going to do? And we'd say, well, you can come in with your dog. You want to hear about God, and you've been living under the bridge all night, come on in with your dog and park the dog under the pew and get a cup of coffee and learn about God. Are you sober? No, not entirely. Can you be polite? Okay, you can stay.
Wow. This is like a foreign land to me, honestly. And I think for a lot of us that are used to, just being in kind of conservative evangelical churches, we don't have a clue. We may think we do, but you probably had to learn the hard way.
Yeah, I did.
Through the school of hard knocks, as they say.
Well, and the odd thing, it really changed my thinking. I had been in huge 2,000-member churches as a pastor. I'd been in Presbyterian churches, and I'd worked in a lot of churches. And I came to this kind of weird conclusion that suppose we didn't have any church buildings anywhere in America. Suppose those didn't exist. If all you had was a New Testament, and you picked up a New Testament and read it, and you realized who Jesus was, and you realized the Holy Spirit was alive and well in America doing something somewhere, and you had no church buildings, where would you go to meet Jesus? And my guess is most of us would say, well, I don't know for sure, but I bet he's down amongst the poor.
Yes.
If I read a New Testament, I'd pick he's down amongst the poor, and I would go to the trailer parks, and I would go to the urban street people. I would go to the poor sections of town, because if I didn't have church buildings, I'd assume this must be where Jesus is hanging out.
Wow, it's interesting to hear your story, and I know you have a lot more. That ministry, you were there for about 6.5 years. God has obviously moved you into new territory now. We want to hear more about that story and how you got there. You have the Gathering House in the Garland District, along with the Streetwise Cafe, and we're very anxious to hear more about that ministry, what God is doing, and where you are now. So we'll talk more with Rob Bryceson in just a moment. Keeping the phone lines open here today at 888-448-5624. If you have a comment or a question on what we're talking about, feel free to give us a call.
It is 7:35, 44 with some showers here in Spokane. And we're talking with Rob Bryceson. Our next Church in Action is this coming Sunday, 10 o'clock at the Gathering House in the Garland District. You're invited to attend there, and we're going to find out more about the Gathering House here in just a moment. But Dee and I have just been intrigued by the street ministry that Rob has done on the streets of Spokane, and there's a book on the topic.
Yes, Rob has actually written a book, a very, very... I started reading it just the other day and was immediately drawn in, but it's called Lessons from a Church in Zombie Land. And what an amazing title for a book right there. I mean, that is just incredible. And certainly, you've been sharing some of your stories this morning with us, Rob, and you got a real taste for what that was all about. Unexpected. You had no idea that God was going to, draw you into urban church, downtown setting within the poverty culture that you knew nothing about, and yet
I
he
had no talent or skill for.
Yeah. And there you were, and I mean, it is just amazing to hear how, God worked in the midst of all of that, very unexpected things. You were downtown for about 6.5 years here in Spokane, and then God led you to open up a new church, the Gathering House in the Garland District, which I love the name of that. I mean, it is just so warm, so inviting, so welcoming. Nothing traditional about that name.
No,
that's for sure. But I'd love to hear some of the story of that and how you got there, and what you're doing now, and you know.
Well, let's. I mean, I took a whole book to tell the story, so I'll try to be brief about it. But it was, in the end, we had 35 members, 20 drunks, and 4 dogs in church on a Sunday. And Christians would say, oh, that's the Lord's work. Jesus would do that. Non-believers would say, that's what Jesus would do. More churches should do that. But the reality is, nobody wants to come to that church. So the church was dying. People don't want to go to a church that doesn't smell good and sit next to a homeless guy who's been on the street for 3 or 4 days. And so people wouldn't come. So we were just dying financially. The ministry was thriving, but the church entity, the corporation side, was dying. And we decided, look, we have 150 coming to our meals, 30, 40 coming to church. We seriously help 10 or 12 really get out of that hole and get their lives back. And most of those we send out of state, reunited them with family in Colorado or Alaska, place we'd buy them plane tickets to reunite them with family and things. We said, if we're seriously helping the 12 and we're going broke anyway, what if we relocated, and what if we did something different? What if instead of focusing on the 150, 200 street people every week, we just put our focus on the 12? And I felt like, being the chairman of the Homeless Coalition, watching Spokane, that we do a really good job with food, housing, shelter. There's great agencies out there doing phenomenal work. But what was missing was job training. So once a person's got a little bit of sobriety, they've had some health, Frontier Behavioral Health has helped them with some mental issues. They've gotten themselves some HUD housing. They got a little divey apartment downtown. They're on food stamps. What's the next step up now?
Sure.
Well, it's basically getting a job.
Right.
Well, how do you get a job in Spokane when your resume says 2 years in jail, 3 years on the street?
Right. Exactly.
Right? You don't. Nobody will hire you. And so we felt like, what if we could create a space where these guys and ladies could get a job experience, start learning middle-class ways, and then we could just close that do church in there on Sunday. And we felt like a coffee shop was the way to go, because it's where we build relationships and friendships, and the public would come. There's rules in the poverty culture. For instance, in a poverty culture, you wear your emotions on your sleeve. So if I'm mad at you, I have to scream and yell and cuss at you so that you know I'm serious, so that you know how offended I am or how angry I really am.
Right.
And it's just a way of showing how serious this situation is.
Okay.
Well, in middle-class culture, we're like, no way. That'll get you fired.
Exactly.
Right? We don't play by those rules. We have a whole different set of rules. They don't know that. Poverty culture people who, especially those raised in generational poverty, they don't know our middle class rules, and none of us in the middle class ever take time to teach them.
Right.
Right.
Interesting. That is so. Yeah. I mean, even I'm getting an education as I listen to you.
Yeah. So when you see a street
So
person kind of yelling and screaming, you're like, well, that guy's out of control. It's like in their culture, he's just being normal. It's like, I've had guys talk to me about getting in fights. I'm like, hey man, you don't have to fight that guy. He goes, nah, I got to go in a back alley and beat him down now. I'm like, what do you mean you got to beat him down? He goes, well, he just disrespected me. I said, I know, but so what? You can let that pass. He goes, no, you see all these other guys that were watching? They're all going to know he disrespected me. And if I don't go beat that guy down in the back alley, my stuff's going to get stolen. I'm going to get kicked. They're going to jump me. So I got to prove myself now. And they would go into a fight they didn't want to be in because the social rules made them.
Wow. Okay. So back to now what you're doing with the Streetwise Cafe. You said you recognize that the one element that's missing for these people is the job training.
Yeah.
And that's why you're doing the Streetwise Cafe.
It was. And the food part, people don't know this, but downtown we'd produced a flyer. Everywhere you could get a free meal downtown for dinner, you flip it over. Everywhere you could get a free lunch and a free breakfast.
Okay.
The downtown population of homeless people are well taken care of.
Sure, they know how the system works, right?
Honestly, I mean, I know all the guys who are flying cardboard signs in front of Dick's, right? They weren't hungry, and I knew them by name, and I knew one or two were legitimately like, I need $40 to put an application in to get housing, so they're out there trying to get that. But most of them were getting drunk or high. So what I realized is let's let Catholic Charities and Salvation Army and City Gate and some of the other great charities that are out there doing the food part, which is thriving anyway, let's let them do that. And we'll move ourselves to this other end of the spectrum. So when someone's been through a Catholic Charities program or a Union Gospel Mission program or a Salvation Army program, sort of is gotten up a little higher in their effort to get out of poverty, let's cull our people from them. So we'd call UGM, hey, we got a position open. We'd call Salvation Army or Catholic Charities. You got somebody who would you need this step, and then they would hand them up to us. We'd be like, okay, let's see how this works.
All right. That is so awesome to hear that. And so then you bring them in, and give them an opportunity there at the Streetwise Cafe.
Baristas working in our kitchen. We do fantastic gourmet grilled cheese sandwiches.
I was looking at your menu the other day, and I thought, oh, they know what they're doing there.
And it's quite a hangout coffee shop. So a lot of the intent was also to get people who've been in a tough life to start mixing and mingling with middle-class people and sort of learning. So a lot of what we teach is not how to make a latte or how to grill a sandwich. A lot of it is how to manage yourself. What the expectation, right? It's people skills. And it's still 50-50 whether someone's going to make it. We have found in our situation, a person who's coming out of drug addiction has relapsed more often than a person coming out of prison. For some reason, a guy coming out of prison is more determined to get his life back that we have found.
Sure.
And so they don't want to go back. Where the guy who's used to getting loaded will often think, well, I can just get high on Friday night one time. Right?
Yeah.
And so we've seen a lot of so it just varies.
Sure, you bet. Oh, I think it's wonderful. I drive by there. We don't live too far from where you guys are located. And even before I had a chance to meet you, I saw the sign, the gathering house and the cafe, and I was immediately drawn to it. So I imagine, you have a lot of people, from the other side, the middle class people that are now beginning to come to your church, the gathering house, and I'd like to hear, a little bit about both sides of that and how it's meshing and some of what you do as far as the teaching that you do on Sunday mornings and how that side of it is working.
Yeah, well, when we made the move, the street population didn't necessarily come. They didn't really come with us. They stayed downtown. So we positioned ourselves instead to be more of an influencer at a different level of dealing with streets. So the Spokane Homeless Coalition meets in our coffee shop at 9 o'clock first Thursday of every month. And there's over 100 people in there representing every agency in town that works with street population. And so we're doing a lot of coordinating. Jonah Project hangs out in our coffee shop. They rescue girls out of sex trafficking.
Right.
Safe Families, Derek Cutlett with Safe Families. They help moms who need to go in for 30 days of rehab or get a jail sentence. They sort of rescue their kids in an interim place before they get picked up by Child Protective Services. Spokane Fatherhood Initiative. We've had NAACP meetings in there. So instead of working directly with the street people anymore, what our coffee shop kind of does is it's a hub of all the institutions and ministries that are working with the street people.
Okay.
And so being that we were a little church at the time, that became an easier thing.
Sure.
We brought the old church pews with us. We converted them to the tables. So when you walk in, you're like, that table looks interesting. It's like, it's a 65-year-old solid oak church pew.
Oh,
They got converted to a table. And if you look at the barista bar carefully, when you walk in, you're like, hey, that's the old church pulpit, isn't it? And it's like, yeah.
Okay.
So we brought some of that with us.
So it's not, you don't walk in and you sit down in the standard pews. You guys are kind of gathered around tables.
Literally, yeah. It's a cafe.
Okay.
If you were to just walk into it, you wouldn't even know it's a church. You just see it's like a coffee shop with a stage.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's been interesting because the number one thing that grew our church once we moved there was the coffee shop. People would come to the coffee shop, realize it was a church, ask about it, and so they'd attend services. The number one thing that killed our coffee shop was the word church on the building.
I bet. Sure.
The hostility. I had underestimated the hostility the public has to churches.
Interesting. Rob, so the public is invited to the Streetwise Cafe.
Yeah, it's a standard coffee shop.
That's great. I'd love to see it. Now, what are the hours?
It's 8 a.m. till 3 p.m. at this time. That's what we do, 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. Monday through Friday.
Okay.
And we don't open on Saturdays because we do a lot of events. And so we felt like keeping it open for private bookings of events has been a better move for us.
All right.
We're closed on Sundays because we do church.
Exactly.
There's that C word, though. Okay. Hey, but what's your website?
www.gatheringhouse.org.
Gatheringhouse.org. Now, you're our church in action this coming Sunday, so that's going to be cool. 10 o'clock. Tell us about what the church part looks like.
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. We do a laid back acoustic guitar, kind of laid back worship style, and we work with a lot of I guess I'd call it free floating. We have a prayer wall where people can get up during music and go write a prayer request on a chalk wall. We have a bunch of art at the back. We have what's a prayer counter where people can light a candle or meditate on some of the art, and everybody's free to get up and go take communion. So while we're in the musical part of our worship, people are kind of moving around and experiencing God and using different art forms to do that.
Okay.
And then I'm an expository Bible teacher, so we're going to open up the book of Acts and dig through it chapter by chapter for a year or whatever.
Right. So when you go to the Gathering House, I mean, you're being taught the meat of the word. Yeah.
I dig up the history and the geography and what was going on at the time and why this was weird and, like why when Paul arrives in Corinth was the Las Vegas of the Roman Empire. And explaining that culture of Corinth to people go, oh, I get now why things were the way they were, what he said.
Right. Okay. So, and you have a very, you've been involved with the Evangelical Covenant Church for a lot of years. And, you've got tremendous education. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background there and more of some of your experiences in the traditional church as well.
Came to faith in Assemblies of God, and it was a holy roller Pentecostal, jump a pew and get slain in the spirit. And so I had that experience, and eventually would drift from that to Calvary Chapel Fellowship, and then would go off to Human Lake Christian Camps with Joe Weldon, where I'd win a scholarship to Multnomah School of the Bible. So I went and got a grad degree from Multnomah, where they teach all the sign gifts are dead and gone, and that's all of Satan now. So I was total wild ends of the spectrum. Would go to Western Seminary, got a master's in divinity, worked at Scottsdale Bible Church in Arizona, would go from there to the San Francisco Bay Area and worked at a large Willow Creek model church that was one of the founding charter members of the Willow Creek Association.
Okay.
And so we did the whole high programming, guys on headsets, okay, cue the mic, draw the curtains, lights up, and go, right? So it was all that. And then I left that and did a church plant, and that's when I discovered the Evangelical Covenant. I had been ordained in the Baptist General Conference.
Okay.
And did a church plant for 4.5 years down in California, laid that down, and then spent the next 4 years working as the worship leader at a PCUSA Presbyterian church that had been through a split.
Okay. Well, so you've given us just a thorough, look at your background and, what the Lord has taken you through, and which eventually led you to write this book, Lessons from a Church in Zombieland. I am dying to hear a few of the stories that you have shared here. I'm dying to hear some of those stories you have shared here in this book, and so we're going to find out more about that with Pastor Rob Bryceson in just a moment.